Good morning. My name is Will Rich, and I will be joined today by my colleagues, Maddie Wu, Theana Chisholm, and Reese Jones to discuss the future of American foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific region. Before we begin, we would like to thank our experts for joining us today. Thank you, Professor Gavin. Thank you, Professor Green. And thank you, Professor Metz. After Mao's death in 1976, China was on its way toward becoming a responsible stakeholder in the international system. Under Deng's leadership, China reformed its economy, joined a plethora of international institutions, and adopted domestic laws similar to those of other liberal democratic nations. Engagement was a prudent strategy. However, Xi Jinping has officially brought that era of pragmatic, non-ideological governance in China to a crashing halt. In its place, he has developed a new form of authoritarian nationalism that shapes China's politics, economy, and foreign policy. Xi is the most powerful leader since Mao. He has purged his political rivals, increased state surveillance, and removed term limits on the presidency. At the heart of Xi Jinping thought, which is now the official dogma of the Chinese Communist Party, is a plan to make the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation a reality by 2049. Xi feels a profound obligation to restore China to its historical status as the central power in global affairs. This, of course, means undermining global stability and expanding its power and influence at the expense of others. Taiwan, in particular, is a potential flashpoint for conflict. The People's Republic of China views Taiwan as its sovereign territory and has not ruled out the use of force to achieve reunification. Given the United States' economic and strategic interest in the region, these ambitions make China a significant threat to global stability and U.S. national security. In recent years, China has rapidly expanded its military capabilities. Since 2020, it has more than doubled its nuclear arsenal, and its navy is now the largest in the world. China has also gained significant economic leverage by securing a tight grip over the critical mineral supply chains. China maintains 60% of the world's rare earth mining production and approximately 90% of its processing and refining capacity. The United States' heavy reliance on China for these essential minerals is a major national security threat. As high-ranking officials within the Biden administration have expressed, this is a decisive decade. China's domestic challenges, including its slowing economy and rapidly aging population, do not mitigate its potential threat. In fact, these pressures may prompt Beijing to act most aggressively sooner rather than later, while a window of opportunity still exists. Historical precedents provide a stark warning. Much like Germany in 1914 or Japan in 1940, nations under internal strain have often pursued assertive military actions abroad as a means to consolidate power. Therefore, the risk of an all-out conflict in the region is becoming an increasingly alarming reality. To avoid catastrophe, the U.S. must immediately enhance defense measures and develop a coherent, robust strategy of deterrence. To be clear, we are not in favor of regime change. We do not aim to interfere with China's internal affairs. Instead, we seek to curtail Chinese aggression abroad. Our grand strategy to do so is threefold. First, we must strengthen our alliances in the region by establishing a collective security framework akin to NATO. This initiative would facilitate regular strategic dialogues, enable joint military exercises, and enhance intelligence sharing among member nations, thereby improving interoperability and readiness. Furthermore, the U.S. should join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. Membership in this agreement would bolster economic ties with our allies, fostering greater regional cooperation and goodwill. Second, we must gain a greater control over the supply chains for essential technologies and impose stricter tariffs on Chinese goods. This includes establishing a formal trade relationship with the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country rich in minerals. Furthermore, we will bolster our domestic production capabilities by expanding lithium and cobalt mining within the United States. Lastly, we plan to allocate $100 billion over the next 5 years to boost defense capabilities in the region and deter an invasion or blockade of Taiwan. I will now turn the floor over to Maddie Wu, our regional expert.
I'm Maddie, and today I will be discussing our regional strategy for the Indo-Pacific. As the US, our allies in the Indo-Pacific are our biggest and most important asset against China. Thus, we are proposing a two-pronged approach for our regional strategy. First, we want to establish an Asian NATO, or what we are calling IMPACT, the Indo-Pacific Treaty. Second, we want to make an effort to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. China has not only been trying to coerce and entice our allies, but President Xi Jinping has launched 4 different initiatives to bolster China's efforts to create the world's largest platform for international cooperation and lead the way in reforming the international system. These initiatives are the 2013 Belt and Road Initiative and the newer Global Development, Security, and Civilization Initiatives, which were established in 2021, 2022, and 2023, respectively. While China has been largely unsuccessful in its efforts to coerce and entice our allies, a few failures is not going to deter China from continuing its efforts to sway our allies into sitting this one out. Thus, it is our responsibility to reinforce and formalize our alliances through the formation of IMPACT and joining the CPTPP. China can't win if we mobilize the power and unity of the region. Over the past 5 to 10 years, we have done a really good job of harnessing our allies through coalitions like the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad, formed in 2018, an informal alliance between India, Japan, Australia, and the US, and AUKUS, established in 2021, which is an alliance between Australia, the UK, and the US. However, these treaties are simply not enough in our efforts to deter China, much less win a war against them. For that reason, we are proposing the establishment of an Indo-Pacific NATO, which we believe should be called IMPACT. At its outset, the members will be the US, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines, as we see these to be the most powerful nations in the region and the ones that would most likely commit to joining such an alliance. We believe that the establishment of IMPACT would be the best way to deter China from seeking further escalation, but also aims to ensure the stability of the Indo-Pacific more generally. The key difference between IMPACT and informal treaties like AUKUS and the Quad is that IMPACT will have a strictly organized chain of command. It allows for the pooling of resources and expertise. It is a force multiplier, and ultimately, the combined capacity of all of these groups is formidable. NATO, as we know, is the most successful alliance in history, primarily because of its ability to deter wars from breaking out. We see no reason why the Indo-Pacific can't have its own version of this alliance. Of course, we recognize that some of our allies may be hesitant to join such an alliance because it may affect their ability to continue trade with China. For that reason, the second part of our regional strategy is to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. On February 4th, 2016, former President Barack Obama signed the proposal for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a free trade agreement between the US and 11 other countries, making it one of the world's most expansive trade partnerships. This agreement was also extensive in what it guaranteed, as it went well beyond categories traditionally included in agreements of this kind. It would have removed tariffs between all participating members, and it covered policies on investment and government procurement, labor and environmental standards, agriculture, intellectual property, and sectors like state-owned and small and medium-sized enterprises. Due to domestic political challenges, the agreement was never actually ratified and was ultimately struck down at the beginning of the Trump presidency. President Donald Trump's decision to strike the TPP has arguably been our greatest blunder in the Indo-Pacific. Contrary to President Trump's belief that the agreement would crumble without the US, in 2018, the 11 remaining countries rebranded the pact to become the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. The 2018 agreement maintains the 30 original chapters of the 2016 proposal, but suspended 22 of the more US-specific commitments. In 2020, the members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, China, and 5 other regional partners established their own free trade agreement called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Though this partnership is not nearly as expansive in terms of its guarantees as the CPTPP, the significant overlap in members between the two agreements gives China the opportunity to strengthen its ties with our allies. As it currently stands, China has a chokehold over the majority of the world's most critical technologies and has tremendous leverage over global supply chains. Under these two trade agreements, China's influence over global supply chains becomes even greater. This is not only destabilizing for the US economy, but also has the potential to have devastating geopolitical implications. China will have the ability to weaponize critical supply chains similar to how it did during the pandemic. Free trade has always been a top priority for our allies. If we don't make an effort to align our priorities with theirs, we leave them open and vulnerable to economic coercion and weaponized interdependence. However, by joining the CPTPP, the US can expand our free trade networks and can use the agreement as a foundation to build more resilient and trusted supply chains, reducing China's leverage. To be clear, we are not forcing our allies to cut their trade relations with or withdraw from any agreements with China. Rather, we want to increase our own trade relations with our allies. Joining the CPTPP will not only foster goodwill between us and our allies, but more importantly, if we join the partnership, we limit China's influence over the global economy and protect our most valuable asset, our allies. I will now be turning over to my colleague Thiana to talk about the economy.
I am Thiana, and today I will address the US economic strategy regarding China. The US must combat China's growing economic influence by securing its supply chain for critical technologies and implementing stricter tariffs on Chinese goods. China's economic efforts to dominate international markets are not driven solely by security concerns. Instead, they are weapons of mass destruction, intended to coerce and entice other countries to enforce their will. China's dominance in critical technologies such as minerals for semiconductor wafers, electric batteries, and solar panels are crucial for combating climate change. And China's dominance cannot be allowed to continue. Critical minerals are the backbone of every modern technology, from the latest commercial electronics to the strategic defense equipment required for our national security. These vital minerals include gallium, fluorine, arsenic, and copper. China currently controls global critical mineral supply chains, producing approximately 60% of the world's supply and handling 85% of the processing capacity. Under Xi Jinping's Made in China 2025 policy, China aims to enhance its domestic economy while making other countries increasingly reliant on it for the resources. Semiconductors are integral to all modern technology, and their importance will only grow in the years to come. Nations that secure their own supply chain for critical technologies will shape the rules for the years to come. While no country is entirely self-sufficient, the United States' continued dependence on China's supply of critical minerals turned a trade imbalance into a potential national security threat. Reducing this dependency is crucial to maintaining US economic stability and security. To reduce our dependence on China for the supply of critical minerals, we must establish a formal trade relationship with the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. The DRC is the world's largest producer of cobalt and copper, accounting for approximately 70% of global production. Cobalt is a critical component of lithium-ion batteries, which are extensively used in electronic devices such as smartphones, laptops, and electric vehicles, EVs. Copper, on the other hand, is essential for various electrical components in semiconductors, including interconnects and wiring. Given the strategic importance of these minerals, establishing a robust and formal trade agreement with the DRC is crucial. This is particularly timely, as China, a dominant player in the global critical minerals market, is becoming increasingly unpopular with the DRC. The United States, with its long history and established diplomatic relations with the Congo, is well positioned to capitalize on this opportunity. In order to reduce our dependence on China for critical minerals, we must expand our domestic lithium and cobalt mining. Currently, the Silver Peak mine in Nevada is the only active lithium mine in the US. But promising sites like Thacker Pass in Nevada also should be further explored, as this ensures a secure supply chain and supports green technology growth. Expanding cobalt mining is equally important. The Iron Creek project in Idaho is a significant cobalt resource. Developing this project will reduce US dependence on foreign cobalt supplies. President Biden has recently imposed significant tariffs on a range of Chinese imports, including electric vehicles, semiconductors, and solar panels. The tariffs on EVs, for instance, have been raised from 25% to 100%, while those on solar panels and semiconductors have been increased from 25% to 50%. By doing so, the US aims to ensure that domestic investments in green energy and other strategic sectors are not undermined. The US has previously implemented successful export controls against Chinese tech giant Huawei, restricting its access to critical technologies and networks due to security concerns. These measures have limited Huawei's influence and safeguarded US national security. Similarly, the current tariffs aim to protect strategic sectors from undue foreign influence and ensure long-term economic stability. The US should not hesitate to pursue similar measures against other Chinese companies as needed, especially those posing a threat to national security. We cannot afford to rely on China for essential technologies like EVs, solar panels, or minerals. Such reliance is a strategic vulnerability. Implementing these economic policies will prevent China from leveraging its economic and technological networks to achieve its geopolitical goals, ensuring that our critical industries remain robust and secure. I will now hand it over to Reese, our military expert.
Good morning. My name is Reese Jones, and today I will be talking about why and how China poses a threat to Taiwan in this decade, why Taiwan is vital to American interests, and how America can successfully deter China. President Xi Jinping has a fundamental desire for unification with Taiwan, one of the primary goals of the Chinese administration since 1949, and he has repeatedly displayed a desire for unification to be one of the crowning achievements of his administration. However, time is slowly ticking, as President Xi Jinping celebrated his 71st birthday just under 2 weeks ago. For this reason, it is likely that after Chinese military modernization completes in 2027, that the People's Liberation Army would see Taiwan as its top target. There are several possible paths for China to attempt unification with Taiwan, the first of which, diplomacy, is bound to fail because of the lack of a popular appetite in Taiwan for peaceful unification, because the CCP failed to uphold one China, two systems in Hong Kong. This leaves only forceful actions for Chinese attempts at unification, particularly a land invasion of Taiwan or a blockade. While there are many risks and obstacles that suggest that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be highly costly, if not infeasible, what matters in determining Chinese future action is not the facts on the ground, but the facts as the Chinese administration sees them. American war games, like several done by the RAND Corporation and CSIS, all point to the fact that Taiwan will inevitably fall to Chinese forces without direct US military involvement, as Chinese leadership believes that American resolve on the Taiwan issue is far lesser than theirs, that Beijing could believe that America would abandon Taiwan in the event of an invasion. Furthermore, the American Navy is getting weaker compared to China's. 90% of the current displacement gap is made up of carriers and amphibious assault ships. Aircraft carriers have not seen peer conflict since the end of the Second World War. With the very significant developments in missile technology and carriers' recent poor performance in drills, Chinese analysts could doubt that carriers represent a significant threat. American interests in Taiwan are both economic and strategic. Because of American reliance on Taiwanese high-end semiconductors for industries that make up a significant portion of U.S. GDP growth, in 2022, U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo warned that the U.S. could go into a deep and immediate recession if the U.S. were to lose access to Taiwanese chips, which would happen in the event of both an invasion or a blockade. If China successfully took over Taiwan, it would shatter the first island chain. The loss of the first island chain would lead to a cascade of impacts, including the loss of American ability to monitor Chinese submarines, thus a great increase in the strength of the Chinese nuclear triad, as well as Chinese capabilities in the South China Sea. That increase would likely prevent America from doing anything to stop Beijing from enforcing the 9-dash line, and thus China's control of the critical economic zone that is the South China Sea. We need to heavily invest in our capabilities in making sure that China believes military force is infeasible for achieving its aims of unification so that we may achieve complete deterrence by denial. This means making a tight crossing of the Taiwan Strait impossible, and preparing Taiwan to be able to hold out against a Chinese blockade by strengthening our ability to keep the island supplied. The best way to make a crossing of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan untenable is by targeting the Chinese ability to cross the strait. The two most effective deterrents would be heavy investments in incredible naval vessels and in the replicator drone program. Increased quantities of destroyers and Virginia-class submarines would overcome shortcomings in American Battle Force ship numbers. And while there is already a necessary push in Washington for increased production of both classes, procurement has been incredibly slow due to a lack of American shipyard capacity. We must bolster this capacity by subsidizing shipyards and enabling subsections to be built across the United States and transported to shipyards for assembly. The replicator drone program, the Pentagon's investment in arming Taiwan with AI-bolstered drone swarms targeting Chinese vessels crossing the strait, ought to be greatly enhanced as to leave no doubts to these drones' capability. America needs to be in a position to keep Taiwan afloat with food and other supplies in the event of even the harshest Chinese blockade. Taiwan maintains a food supply large enough to last the country only 6 months in the event of a crisis. It would be essential for Taiwan's ability to hold out against a prolonged 1 to 2 year long blockade, and that the United States be able to keep Taiwan afloat by air so that it may do so, and the Army War College says we are currently unable to do that. Especially significant is that the United States invests now, before a crisis, in Taiwan's logistical network, so that food distribution and storage can be successful when we have to. The United States must also invest in our bases in Guam, in Okinawa, and in Lalo Airport in the Philippines, so that the U.S. may successfully keep Taiwan fed via air. Increasing our investment in shipyard capacity, the replicator drone program, and the Indo-Pacific logistical network are necessary now so that China, with the desire and the willpower to take over Taiwan, comes to believe that it cannot coerce Taiwan into submission, because even an unsuccessful coercive action could lead to possible further escalation and have devastating impacts on the flow of global trade and semiconductors, and thus precipitate a global economic crisis. I would like to invite my colleague Will up to conclude.
Engagement simply will not work. Xi Jinping would undoubtedly exploit such efforts to expand China's influence and strengthen its own capabilities. In the coming years, we must thoroughly outcompete China diplomatically, economically, and militarily so that Beijing loses the capability to meaningfully harm U.S. interests. A more resolute policy of confrontation today is necessary to bring about a less threatening China tomorrow. With unwavering resolve, we can safeguard the future of our global community. Thank you.
All right, let's hear questions from our experts.
How's this? Can everybody hear me? All right, so my first question, I want to introduce a hypothetical situation. And that hypothetical situation is there's a change in Taiwan's domestic politics. And Taiwan, in fact, does decide that they're amenable to peaceful reunification. So my question for you is that catastrophic for the United States' interests? Is that something that the U.S. would that devastate the United States economically? Would it devastate regional order? So if it was not about a military intervention, but it was just about reunification, would that be such a problem for the U.S.? And if so, what would the U.S. do under those circumstances?
Can I supplement that? 'Cause that's an excellent question. Flip side of that, Taiwan declares independence. What does the U.S. do?
So your first question, if the Taiwanese people decide that they would like to reunify with China, I believe that the U.S. should adopt a policy, shoring manufacturing to the United States, such as the CHIPS Act that we've already done. And I think that some of the policies that we've recommended, such as the impact or the Asian NATO, would help balance power in that region if China were able to acquire Taiwan peacefully.
To build off of that, it would be catastrophic to our strategic interests that we would have to invest in Asian NATO, particularly investing in the Philippines for instance. But it would be less catastrophic for economic policies, at least in the immediate future, because there wouldn't be an immediate cutoff from high-end Taiwanese semiconductors, but we would have to invest in shoring those manufacturing, as Will said, just so they don't have that leverage on us.
And to the second part of the question, we do not support Taiwanese independence. If they choose to reunify peacefully, then we will take these necessary measures to counterbalance China's actions, but we don't support Taiwanese independence.
I guess, though, to Rachel's question, the variable of Taiwan's domestic politics would seem to be a pretty crucial variable that runs the spectrum. I mean, I guess there was less in the presentation on that than one could imagine. You could imagine Rachel's excellent scenario idea where the KMT gets back in power and they say, we can work this out. You can imagine the current leader, the DPP, who's definitely got independent streak. Then you've got somewhere in the middle, which is where we are today, where Taiwan's spending less of its GDP percentage than we are on defense, and doesn't seem to be particularly worked up about it. So I guess the larger question is how you just think about what might be either the first or second most important variable, which is Taiwanese domestic politics.
I think we should utilize our leverage that we currently have over the Taiwanese government, as in we're supplying security assistance to them, and although our policy is strategic ambiguity, I think that in a case of a Chinese invasion, we would likely come to help Taiwan. And I think that we should not change our one China policy, and we should kind of use our military leverage, our economic leverage to keep Taiwan on the same page as us.
And on the KMT, the vast majority of the Taiwanese population is radically opposed to any sort of unification peacefully with the mainland, but there are parts of the mainland, of the KMT in particular, which is advocating for more cooperation with China, but no reasonable politician that has a chance of getting elected in Taiwan due to, I think it's around 86 to around 96% of the Taiwanese population is opposed to reunification peacefully, that the KMT might work with China, but it'll never peacefully join.
Right, that can change though, that those statistics were different pre-Hong Kong, and you could imagine a Chinese strategy that was smarter and wiser, that aimed to, the 2 million Taiwanese work in South China. The largest source of foreign direct investment in China's amazing growth in the last 30 years is not from the US or Japan, it's from Taiwan. Right? You can imagine the point is not what the situation is today. The point is that this is a crucial variable. For example, what would your policy do if I could tell you we could solve the semiconductor problem? Which, one can imagine 10 years from now, the reliance on high-end Taiwanese chips no longer is an issue, right? That's the whole point of the CHIPS Act, that you don't have to rely on Taiwan anymore. I guess how you think about this shifting variable of what happens in Taiwan, if its domestic politics are different, if their sort of chip production is less important, how does that play into this, American interests?
I'm not an economic expert, plainly, but I can say on the domestic political issue that the trend is only moving towards us, that the younger generations in Taiwan are especially more opposed to unification or working with China than the older generation are, as demographics change. And furthermore, the memory of Hong Kong won't ever go away. That it's not as if the CCP, in 10, 20 years, the CCP can just hide the fact what it did to Hong Kong, to the Taiwanese people. That they may have taken a bit different direction 10, 20 years ago, but not now.
I think even more impressive than what they did to Hong Kong was what happened in Tiananmen Square. But if you looked at those public opinion polls after Tiananmen Square, you would have found a very different answer, right, about what people thought about China. Like the changes, as you point out, have been in relatively recent history. So it's not a question, it's just sort of a comment, which is that I'm not sure I would place extreme confidence in what the trends look like today. The broader question that I'd like to ask is akin to Professor Gavin's question for all of you, which is, what are the facts about the world that if they changed or you discovered was wrong, would change your mind about the policy? Right? So to give a trivial example from your presentation, early in it, you pulled up this chart showing China has more ships than the United States, right? But then later in the presentation, you helpfully pointed out that, like, actually, if you wanted to do a naval comparison that made sense, you'd really want to compare tonnage, and then you'd want to know what that tonnage was of, and then you would realize that naval warfare is highly asymmetric, and so maybe even tonnage itself doesn't matter, right? And so that might lead you, right, if you were heavily focused on ships, to change your mind once you understood those facts. Again, I think that's trivial. That doesn't matter especially much to your argument. But what are the things that do, right? What if you what would you have to learn to think, this policy is not so good?
I think there'd have to be a fundamental change in Beijing with their ideology and with their policies. At the current moment, they're not flexible, and they have been very clear about their ambitions, and as long as they are set on being aggressive and assertive abroad, we need to match that aggression and assertiveness abroad with a forceful response in order to change their behavior. We don't see any signs currently of them willingly changing their behavior.
And just to add on to what Will said, if the economic environment in China changes, because right now we are saying that, or from our research, we're examining China's capabilities. They have the growing desire to unify with Taiwan, they have the economic capabilities. So in the event that China does not have the economic capabilities, they would not be able to fund their military as effectively as the US or Taiwan would. So in the case that the economic environment in China is in a drastic decline, then that would change the policies that we would use to address this issue. Because economics plays a huge role in our policies.
I suppose, to me, it wouldn't be the change in the facts as they are, but say listening to the Politburo and hearing what they have to say would maybe change my mind if they believe that the United States was sufficient and would remain sufficient deterrence against their actions in Taiwan. But I don't believe I would ever be able to access the real Politburo conversations, and that leaves me with rhetoric, and I'm scared of just listening to rhetoric.
Now I want to ask you about the hypothetical that deterrence fails and the PRC attempts to take Taiwan by force. So you make the case, or correct me if I'm wrong, each of you are saying that the US should defend Taiwan in that scenario. Okay. So my question for you is, how do you think that war ends? Do you think that war ends with catastrophe for the United States? Do you think that war ends? We talked yesterday about escalation. We talked about when there's war between nuclear armed powers, if someone loses, it's they decided to lose. They decided not to use their nuclear weapons against the adversary. So if you're making the case that it's in the United States' interest to fight over Taiwan, are you making the case that actually that war is going to go okay for the United States, that China will decide we're willing to lose Taiwan, we're willing to lose this war rather than escalate to nuclear use, or to, actually there are other alternatives for China that could be catastrophic to the United States as well. So are you saying the war wouldn't be so bad? Or are you saying that, yes, the war could potentially end in nuclear war? There could be nuclear use. There could be destruction of American cities. But that is a price we're willing to pay because the consequences of not defending Taiwan are so catastrophic that that catastrophe outweighs this plausible end state.
We're not convinced. Personally, in my analysis, what would happen in a great power war is it would be some form of a stalemate. Plainly, I don't believe either side is willing to risk the destruction on their country, or in fact the world or the global economy, and thus to their regime and their power that would come from a nuclear war. And I'm not sure what exactly other catastrophic term, you mentioned the others, and I'm not sure what they are.
Conventionally loaded hypersonic missiles.
Cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, the satellites go yah-yah, and now we can't leave low Earth orbit anymore.
I guess the question would be, China loses the first 8 times. Why do you think they don't go back to 9th? What makes you think, if they believe this is their Florida, that they're ever going to accept defeat? And at what point do the American people say, you know what? Maybe losing Los Angeles for what they consider to be their Florida might not be the deal we want to sign up for.
I think personally that even if we lose the war, even if we go to a stalemate in their favor, that is better than just lying over and letting them take Taiwan. That would shatter our credibility everywhere. That would shatter pretty much anything. It would effectively force the United States into an isolation. That even if we have to give concessions, which I think we would for any reasonable stalemate at the end of a conventional conflict, that is a better outcome than just letting them take Taiwan.
The destruction of Los Angeles?
No.
Well, that's fine, but not another city.
Yeah, not San Francisco.
What I'm saying is, I think even in the event that, say, the United States Navy totally and utterly destroys the Chinese Navy, we take casualties and there's a grave and horrible loss of human life, but we have to offer something. Maybe the Kinmen Islands. Maybe we would not be able, and I don't think we'd be willing to just let them not empty-handed. We'd have to give them something, but something is better than everything, I think.
Why do you think they would take that deal?
Because their navy has been utterly destroyed. I think they'd accept something that would allow them to stay in power than utter catastrophe that would make them lose power.
Why do you think fighting a war with the United States would weaken their domestic legitimacy? At what point, when states fight great power wars, what is the logic that makes you think, when Stalin was losing in 1942 or 1943, do you think his regime was in great danger?
I'm not sure if the Chinese believe that an aggressive war on the Taiwan would be something akin to Operation Barbarossa. That would be a German threat on their homeland. It would be an attack on Hawaii more than an attack on Operation Barbarossa. And I don't think.
Let me ask you this. So you're looking at Hong Kong, and you make the decision that by moving in the way you have in Hong Kong, you remove the possibility, as you correctly pointed out, of what was 40 years of policy of kicking the can down the future and peaceful unification. In addition, you probably alienate all the fence sitters in the region, from the Philippines to South Korea to even Vietnam. And you also probably cost your economy tens of trillions of dollars, because there's only 3 places in the world where you can actually raise independent capital: London, New York, and Hong Kong. You've effectively shut that down. Does that strike you as a state that isn't willing to bear some costs in order to get what it considers a fundamental interest?
Well, my difference in the characterization of that is they're willing to bear some costs to their economy, to their prosperity, but I don't think the Politburo or President Xi would bear the cost that would totally oust him from power or even kill him in the event of, say, a nuclear war. I think that's not a risk that they're willing to take to their own personal well-being.
Can I propose an alternative policy? One that is it's a sympathetic adjustment to yours, and then hear your response, criticisms of it. And to motivate it, I'll point to the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? When on Saturday, everybody's talking about the invasion that might have to happen. And the hawks are basically saying, look, if we don't do this, our allies are going to freak out in NATO, right? And our entire credibility with them is going to be undermined. And Kennedy says, our allies don't understand what's about to happen. When it is explained to them the kind of risks that are going to be taken, they are not going to want us to do this, right? And so that night, he sends Bobby to talk to the Soviet ambassador and try to come to some sort of deal. And so maybe the best policy for Taiwan is to take your policy in peacetime, right? Arm ourselves to the teeth, try as hard as we can to deter an attack or a blockade, and then, if the crisis comes, sell the Taiwanese out and make it very clear to all of our allies, look, if you want us to fight, we'll do it, but 1, you're anteing with us, and 2, these are the risks, right? And by the way, the nukes probably go off in the Pacific before they hit CONUS, right? So tell us what you want to do, right? I think you'd get a lot of sympathy for not have the fight, right? So why isn't a policy of bluff actually the sort of optimal policy here?
I'd say if Kishida, the Liberal Democratic Party, Japan, South Korea agree with that, then I agree.
So let me just ask you too, because I think you very correctly point out that an invasion would be difficult, cross-strait invasion would be difficult. And this is why I think most people believe that's not the policy that'll be pursued. It'll be a blockade. And the challenge with the blockade, and Brendan mentioning Cuban Missile Crisis got me thinking about the Berlin situation. And the challenge there is that the U.S. would have to move first in all likelihood, right? Because if you're strangling the economy, you're not taking, and you're cutting off air zones, you're basically forcing the U.S. to make the move to sort of end the blockade by running through it, by shooting down PLA aircraft. And so I guess, and it seems harder to deter that kind of salami tactic sort of action. So I guess play out for me what your policy, what you guys do as this blockade starts to unfold? What is the sort of, especially as you kind of pointed out, they're probably going to be able to pull off the naval part of it. At this point, they're going to be able to pull off the air part of it. What do you do?
I mean, I think, again, look at the Berlin airlift, for instance, that we have jets, the C-5 that can make that trip from Guam and then to another air base, that we could successfully do an airlift logistically if we invest in our infrastructure now.
They shoot down one of those C-5s, what do we do?
What I was about to say was, I think if the Chinese go up for a blockade, they have made the calculus that a war with the United States is not in their best interest, and that's why they've opted for a blockade. But if they shoot down one of our
Like you can shoot down a C-5 with a rubber band. Like, I mean, it's not that hard to do. Or you can make it look like an accident. You can.
If they make it look like an accident.
Which, by the way, there are any number of close call air incidents going on continually right now. What does the U.S. do when that C-5 goes down?
If you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, the first one, nothing.
And then we send another C-5?
We'd have to send a lot for the airlift to work, and if they're shooting down all of them, it would escalate to war. And
right, escalate. Well, what do we do then? They keep shooting them down. They haven't done anything else. What's our next move?
we probably break the blockade with naval force.
And they sink an aircraft carrier.
We probably wouldn't use an aircraft carrier anyway, but...
No, but at some point they just send a message, you better knock this off. They can easily sink an aircraft carrier.
We'd probably it would escalate to war if they choose
Again,
war.
escalate, what does that mean?
We'd shoot down Chinese airplanes. We'd sink a naval vessel of China's.
Actually, let me intervene here. I just want to broaden our discussion a little bit just to get a couple of other points in. One of the things most noticeable about your presentation, you're very much in a kind of Hal Brands, Michael Beckley mode, which is we want to change China's behavior. There are other people associated with a kind of Team B position, people like Matt Pottinger, who essentially argue we need to push for regime change. I noticed you guys are not willing to cross that line. Could you maybe explain to us why that's a limitation you're willing to accept?
Yeah. So we don't want to unnecessarily provoke the Chinese. We think that the risks associated with some of the policies advocated by Pottinger are just extremely high, and they're also costly. Our goal is to alter Chinese behavior and rein in their aggression. We feel that we can adequately do that without interfering in their domestic affairs.
On top of that, it would just be largely unpopular with our allies in the region. Like, we would have no backing to do that, so it wouldn't be something that's feasible to begin with.
So I want to ask you a bit about the allies and partners in the region. My first question is, how satisfied are you with your allies and partners? How satisfied are you with Japan, with the Philippines, with Australia, with South Korea? How confident are you that their contributions to deterrence, and if deterrence fails, to a fight, are meaningful? To the extent that you're not, what should you do about it? And is this really actually not about interoperability at all? Is it just about using all these countries as aircraft carriers, unsinkable aircraft carriers, and just exhausting PRC missile supply by flying from runways all over the place, all over the region?
Okay, I'll start. I'd say that we're pretty confident in our allies' capability to kind of hop on board and join this, I guess, deterrence of China. Japan has made alterations to their constitution that kind of makes them more aggressive than they have been in the past. So I think our allies would be on board very much so with defending Taiwan and supporting our ambitions.
It's the military strategy end of it. I think, especially for the Philippines, for South Korea and Australia and Japan especially have very confident militaries. They're obviously not not where compared to ours, but they are very competent in the region, and they'd be helpful, but they're by far our allies' most important is the fact that they're on single aircraft carriers. And Japan has demonstrated, at least Fumio Kishida, has a demonstrated interest in maintaining Taiwan. I think he would commit very heavily to a defense.
Do you think if the PRC did start raining missiles on all of these allies and partners, they'd continue to let American aircraft fly from their runways? Can we count on these aircraft carriers?
I think we can certainly count on Japan. I'm not familiar enough with the other regimes to know.
Sort of interested just generally about your theory of China, because the beginning of this slide that showed Deng Xiaoping and sort of opening the world order, and then this shift that happens kind of under this new leader. And so I guess what I'm wondering is basically your theory of what is motivating China's behavior. And to what extent you also, in your presentation, pretty much make it seem as if China's behaviors and policies are illegitimate, right? And so you're trying to influence their behavior. I guess my interest is, one, are the causes of China's behavior due to this one particular leader, that there were previous leaders, and that that might argue for a policy of just waiting him out? Is there something structural just in the nature of the international system that just makes this kind of rivalry happen? Or is there something about the way the regime is structured, sort of authoritarian nature, that makes conflict? Because the flip side, I guess I'm wondering, I'm trying to imagine, I'm sitting in Beijing, and I'm thinking to myself, looking at U.S. behavior in the last 20 years, it doesn't seem particularly friendly towards me. The United States, of course, built its greatness on a Monroe Doctrine, where it basically said no great powers can interfere in its region. If you take the Florida-Taiwan analogy seriously, as probably most people in China do, you'd say, well, we don't want a war, but this really is ours. And you've kind of structured an international monetary system where we are totally dependent, everyone's dependent upon the dollar. You've oriented these tariffs and these technology controls on technologies that are essential to us. Like, you don't appear to be oriented in a particularly friendly way to us. And so I guess what I'm interested in is your theory of something short of a war, where China, is this just an implacable, hostile imperial state? And then I guess the second question related to that would be, let's say China said, we just want Taiwan, right? Again, it's our Florida. And after that, we're done. That may be right, that may be wrong. It would obviously have these strategic consequences, but we're not interested in Japan. We're not interested, we'll stop messing around with these goofy islands even. Just, would you be willing to live with that, or is there something about Taiwan? Is it the Taiwan issue, or is it the fact that you're worried that China is this kind of neo-imperial power that is set on world domination or regional domination that concerns you? I know there was a lot in there, but basically what I want is your theory for what it is China is doing, what is motivating it, and what its future is, because that would, to me, be a very important variable in how I decided to construct a grand strategy.
I think it's a bit of all of the above. However, mostly the latter. I mean, Xi Jinping is extremely motivated by Chinese history. I think he sees, there's a very rich history in China, and he sees that and feels a profound, it's his profound destiny to bring China back to its peak.
Is that illegitimate?
I don't see why whether or not it's illegitimate that matters too much, because
well, you said that China was seeking to undermine global order in this and threaten direct U.S. interests. So
direct U.S. interests are our interests in the region, the interests of our allies, the interests of Taiwan. I think Xi Jinping is set to serve for life. So he's going to be in office for, quite some time, even though he's relatively old. And I think something that's extremely important is that he's able to control dissent within the Chinese population better than other dictators or authoritarian leaders have been in the past.
Do you think if a free and open poll was taken in China, most people would not support unification with Taiwan?
Can you repeat that question?
Either.
Can you repeat that question?
What do you think, how popular do you think even a democratically elected government would be if it brought Taiwan back into China?
I think it depends on whether that's a peaceful unification or whether that's a forceful unification. I think a forceful unification would be very much in support from the high up officials, but not from the general populace.
Just to go back to the original question, I think it's fundamentally true from what the Chinese administration is saying, that they want sort of an escalation of islands, that they want to take Taiwan, they want to take the Senkakus, the Diaoyu Islands, then they've questioned the legitimacy of Okinawa, that they very clearly are an expansionist power. But even if that's legitimate, even if that's illegitimate, I don't know. But you mentioned the Monroe Doctrine, and it seems that you don't believe that the Monroe, in my mind, the Monroe Doctrine was the United States in the 19th century dominating its region so it could dominate it in the 20th century. This would be China dominating its own region in the 20th century and then going after the United States in the 22nd century.
So we only have 5 minutes left, so we should probably focus our questions. Brendan?
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about why you think like an Asian NATO is such a great idea. Like the existing NATO is sort of a pain in the ass, right? Anytime you want to do anything, you got to get 27, 29, whatever we're at now, other states to sort of come on board. We're kind of running this proxy war in Ukraine by the skin of our teeth, in part because there are disagreements in NATO and you can never get the policy coordinated. Whereas the traditional way of describing Asian alliances with the United States is hub and spoke. A very big hub and smaller in relative terms spokes where the leverage in that relationship rests with the hub, right? And I don't know, that seems sort of sensible. Being the hub is good. It helps you get your partners to do the things you want. So why is that intuition wrong? Why is a NATO model a better model for this region?
And why do you think would Japan and South Korea ever agree to be part of it and something?
Yeah, right. We could call it the comfort women we're all right sort of, alliance, right? And see how Japan and South Korea.
Hold on, this is Maddie's.
Well, okay. I think the case that I made in my portion was that the hub and spoke model just simply isn't enough to deter China. Like an Asian NATO is very much what is required because China has forced us into this era of great power competition. And in order to combat that effectively, we need a more formal alliance as opposed to these kind of informal treaties that we currently have. As for the Japan and South Korea question, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they also have vital interests in the region. Japan it would be a catastrophe for Japan if China were to take Taiwan. South Korea has interests, we believe that South Korea would have interest in joining an Asian NATO because of its plight with North Korea. And so an Asian NATO just seems like the best course of action and the necessary one.
And to build off of that, just look at what's happening right now. South Korea and the Japanese government are working significantly more and more frequently. They've reached somewhat of a sort of tacit agreement that these weak half apologies from the Liberal Democratic Party are enough for South Korea. And putting aside my personal judgment on the matter, just the truth of the matter is they're working closer and closer together. They've seemed to move half past it and are looking forward to being able to move past it fully.
About one last question. Just Tiana, I want to ask you, getting involved in a serious kind of trading relationship with the Congo and getting involved in mining interests there is, under the best of circumstances, going to be very morally ambiguous, very difficult. You could imagine people looking back and saying, oh my God, what a horrible, horrible thing we got involved in for maybe a threat that wasn't real or anything else. How would you deal with concerns about what you're proposing on that kind of level?
So, in addressing that question, I'll also reiterate a point I made in the presentation that China is becoming increasingly unpopular in the region. And while we do know and we do agree that there are great challenges in the DRC right now, specifically related to child labor in the region and human rights issue, in regards to addressing that issue, we would have to come up with fairer policies that are both beneficial to the US and to the DRC as well. So we would then evaluate the policies that China currently has with the DRC and implement measures to ensure that our policies are better than those. So it's not a zero-sum game where the US is only sucking the DRC dry, but it's a mutual relationship where the DRC is being benefited and the US is being benefited also, because we have to ensure that we maintain our supply chain security. Thank you.
All right, let's give TV a round of applause.